I'm Jim Bean, the Provost, and welcome you to our lecture today as part of our Year of the Book series. This is a program jointly sponsored by the University of Oregon Libraries and the Oregon Humanities Center, so I want to thank them for this great idea. Very timely in a period of great discussion of scholarly communications. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce an old friend, Paul Courant. We worked together at Michigan for quite a few years. I was Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in Michigan Engineering, and Paul was the Provost, so as you can imagine, on promotion, tenure, and hiring, and things like that, we had many interesting conversations. But during that time, Paul also worked a lot on the Digital Library Project, which was a huge program at Michigan that was kind of at least an intellectual precursor of a lot of the Google things that you're hearing about now, which started with the Michigan Library and now include Harvard and Wisconsin and lots of others that I'm sure Paul knows more details than I do. Paul's current title is University Librarian and Dean of the Libraries, but he also has his titles the Harold T. Shapiro Collegiate Professor of Public Policy. Harold Shapiro was a president at Michigan when I came there in 1980, went on to be president of Princeton. So it's a very honorable chair to hold. And is also Arthur F. Turnow Professor, which is a very prestigious teaching award, rotating chairs at Michigan. So that's great to see. I also note that you're a professor of economics and a professor of information. I guess you started in economics, right? So I've added many other fields of inquiry during this discussion. Paul is going to talk today on the book, Not Just Another Gadget. So I think there's a provocative title that we'll all find very interesting. So help me to welcome Paul Courant.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for being here. Some people, when they're asked for a title for their talks, actually know what they're going to talk about and give a title that they're going to talk about. And I'm sure that they're good people and nice to their children and their dogs. But I've never been one of those people. So what happens to me is people ask me to give a talk, and I struggle to make up a title. And I'm sure the organizers of this will say that, you know, I wait and finally, under pressure, make up a title. And then I have to figure out, oh, okay, well, if I guess that's the title, that has some implication for what I should actually talk about. And when I made up the title, the book, Not Just Another Gadget, I thought that I was going to say that the book actually wasn't a gadget. It turns out there's an old Jewish joke that I'm not going to tell, in which the punchline is said by the old rabbi to the young student, "No, so life isn't just like a vegetable garden." So this is, I'll tell that later if anyone wants to know it. So actually I do think the book is another gadget, but it's not just another gadget. It is a gadget of extraordinary interest and complexity, having gotten to be that way partly, I think, by various accidents of technology and history that we'll also get into. So I'm going to talk about the book as a gadget, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about publishing and more generally, and also about the Google deal, because reason people really invite me to places is so that I'll talk about the Google deal, so it's what I should do. I posted a blog post some time ago in which I said that blog posts of mine that have the word Google in them get approximately 400 times as many readers as blog posts of mine that don't. That was a made-up number. I have no idea if it's that big, but it's hugely different. The Google, if you actually are looking for fame, just say Google. Okay. So what is special about the book? What makes it not just another gadget? For one thing, there's an amazing level of noise about the death of the book, and now, of course, there's a whole cottage industry on the death of the book. English professors get to these things very quickly. And that the death of the book, the electronic threats to the book make, put all that we hold most dear at risk. They make the debates of my youth about blue laws look quiet. It used to be that things weren't open on Sundays, and then eventually they were, and that was going to be the end of Western civilization. You could argue that it actually was, but we'll discuss that as well. And I don't know of any other instance of technological change around methods of producing something that has caused so much angst as the possibility that the book will be replaced by the clump of electrons. The Luddites and others often have viewed a threat to their own way of life because of a threat to their own income. And you see that going on. And of course, some of the noise that you hear from publishers and media giants really is actually about the threat to their own income rather than the death of civilization as we know it, with good, smart PR firms talking about piracy and the likes. But again, I think this one's different. It's not just about a threat to income. I have to comment, since I'm in Oregon, the best organized group of people ever to withstand a threat to income were people who pump gas, right? That's an extraordinary piece of social policy, which is actually extremely difficult to explain. So that's maybe up there with the book, but we'll. So we always mourn aspects of the old that we loved that are no longer practical, and I actually don't think the book's in that category. So exquisite handwriting. I have a Leica that my father bought in 1953, and I no longer use it to take pictures, even though it's a beautiful instrument, you know, marvelously crafted, nice and heavy, right? They don't do things like that with steel anymore. I used to drive a car with 3 on the column. Now, the 3 on the column was a really bad idea, but we still get sentimental about it. And there were lots of places where there was sort of well-finished heavy steel and wood, which have now been replaced by plastic and carbon fiber. But we get over it. You know, we go to the museum, we look at these things, we say, wow, that was really cool. But we don't actually weep as if the world hasn't come to an end because we lost 3 on the column. In fact, the world is better because we lost 3 on the column. The book is different. And it's not only about income or only about sentiment. People see a risk of loss, not merely of an economic way of life, but of much deeper issues. In an academic setting of a scholarly life, more broadly of a reflective life, the life of the mind, the human ability to absorb and engage in detailed argument and exegesis. The fact is, and I'll get to some speculations about this as I go along, people who like books, serious books, really, really like them and bind their identities to them and are worried either from failure of imagination or deep altruism or both about the ability of humankind as we know it to continue to exist if there are radical changes to the book. I'm being slightly light-hearted, light-touched about this, but I'm not making this up, right? This is, people get very engaged by this. And by the way, there are radical changes to the book. There's no doubt about that. And so all of these things may be at risk, although I want to explore why. It's actually worth noting that, at least as far as I can tell, people who mostly read for lighter fun are much less concerned. Public libraries are doing a land office business in e-readers for romances and mysteries, as are Amazon and Sony and the others who produce e-readers, electronic readers, and sell books to them. I'll talk about the Kindle and its discontents a little later, but my own experience is that I like the Kindle best for to-do lists and straightforward novels where formatting doesn't much matter. And there aren't too many characters or too much length. Robert Parker, of whom I was a great fan, died the other day, and his books are terrific on the Kindle. In fact, the Kindle compresses some of the white space in the paperback editions very nicely. Lush Life by Richard Price is sort of the sort of outer end of complexity for which the Kindle is good. I've recently been reading a novel by Hilary Mantel called Wolf Hall. Very good book, strongly recommend it. It has too damn many characters to be good for the Kindle. You can't flip back and find out where it is that somebody was. And like all good English novels where they change the names of the streets and the people as you go along, you need to be able to do that kind of flipping. But that's a bit of a digression. Actually, you'll notice that digressing is something that I do. So what is it about the book? I come to this discussion as an economist and a librarian, and in the latter role, responsible for a university press that actually publishes books, most of which lose money. Contrary to some popular opinion, economists are neither alchemists nor especially gifted business people. We don't know how to turn lead into gold. We aren't especially good at making money. This came as a very sad disappointment to my library colleagues when I took the job. But we are interested, among other things, in how value, economic welfare, is produced in a society. I want to emphasize that the value I'm talking about here isn't necessarily market value or money value. It's how much people care really about things, want things. And a great deal that's of value, especially in the non-market sector, especially in the university and in the library, is produced by entities that are explicitly and purposefully nonprofit. Now, nonprofit is a euphemism for money losing, and there are very good reasons for why things like universities and libraries are nonprofit. They must be, in order to be intelligible, mission-driven. If all they do is sell the things that they can sell at a profit, then great big chunks of what makes them important and valuable simply don't get done. It's good to say this with the provost in the room. All the librarians are nodding their heads. The provost isn't quite sure he wants to hear this, but actually he knows it's true too, or he never would have gotten into this line of work. And in fact, there's a whole very nice economic literature on the economics of nonprofits and the coexistence of mission and money-driven institutions. And of course, universities, big universities, have both mission-driven and money-driven aspects to them, and figuring out how they can coexist, and indeed how you can divert some of the money from the profitable parts into the unprofitable but vitally important parts is an important work. But basically, one way of summarizing the difference is it's really hard to imagine charitable contributions to a for-profit entity, right? General Motors is every bit as needy as the University of Oregon Library. In fact, loses money on a scale that Deb can't imagine. And yet, nobody's actually making charitable contributions to General Motors except the United States government, and they're not exactly charitable contributions. There's a quid pro quo there. Why do we make charitable contributions? It's because we actually share a set of values with the entity that's receiving them, and we believe that they have it about right about those values, right? So we send our children to colleges who we trust to some extent to socialize them and teach them about things that we care about. And then we also make contributions to those very same colleges for the, or at least they ask us to all the time, and we sometimes make them, for those very same reasons. There's an identity of value here, value in the sense of values, and I think that's much of what's going on with nonprofits. One of the problems with thinking about books in the economy is that they move back and forth between the profit and not-for-profit sectors all the time. Scholarly works are generally, at best, not-for-profit. Sometimes they do a little worse than that. But we have to be careful about figuring out just what parts of whose livelihood is at risk as the production and use of books changes in response to changes in information technology. And we should remember that all of us, almost everybody in this room is in the nonprofit sector. We do actually make a living. They do pay us enough, so that the baby has shoes, and sometimes a bit better than that. And so libraries and university presses, even though they're not in it for the money, If the way in which books are used and distributed changes, maybe are at risk for the work that they do, and that will lead to resistance. Although, again, I'm going to argue that that's not the main thing that's going on here. That's just simple, old-fashioned fear of change, which everybody has often. So let's look at books and what they do for producers, consumers, the system of scholarly engagement, society at large, anybody else who might be interested. And I'm going to start with what's an obvious question before getting into supply and demand and such. So which book are we talking about when we talk about the book? My wife said, as I agreed to be part of this series, so are you going to take our Bible, right, and talk about the book? And I got to say, that was an amusing prospect for a moment, but then I decided that there's some dangers I'd like to stay out of. So which book, though? There are tens of millions of distinct titles attached to books. And of course, there are many copies of many of those books. There aren't as many books in the world as there are people, at least not as many distinct ones, but there are more distinct titles in Oregon than there are people in Oregon, right? No doubt about that. And it's not an artifact of, Oregon. It's true for New York or California, too. Or at least it's certainly true for New York. It's true for California. And that is a key feature of books. There are many copies of most of them, right? If there aren't, there's either been very bad luck, they've gotten destroyed, or somebody made some really bad decisions when they published them, which happens all the time. So which books are we talking about? Old ones or new copies of old ones? The Google project is all about new copies of old books. Do we mean each book? Or just a number of ways in which books are characteristically used? Do we mean, as we often do in research libraries, the totality of all the books? Right? So the great strength of research libraries is if you ask a question of a research library, if you walk in and go to the catalog and talk to a reference librarian, you can figure out in the worst case, within a day, whether anybody in the world, at least in the European or the major Asian languages, has ever studied the question that you've asked, right? There'll be a trace of it somewhere in the published scholarly record. That's an extraordinarily powerful machine that these libraries are, and that works on the totality of all the books, right? No simple collection of just a few 100,000 of them would do, right? And certainly no particular collection in a particular area, although MIT's library, which is a great research library, actually only does science and engineering, right? The library is very weak in other areas, so they can do that, make that same kind of claim as an example for science and engineering. This is an extraordinary feature of academic libraries, totally different from public libraries. Absolutely cannot get the same kind of reach in a public library, but you can in an academic library. So in this case, we're talking about many books. And we also have to ask, do we mean digitized copies, copies sitting on e-readers, or just plain books ordinaire a la codex, the kind that this room is filled with? Separating them out as we have this discussion will at least sometimes be helpful, and we should certainly try to be clear whether we're considering all parts or particular ones. Which books at risk do we care about? So I'm going to take an economist perspective on all this and look at the book and its current relatives, book-like things, bookishness as it's sometimes called. Michael Pollan talks about food-like substances that are edible, and so there are these book-like substances that are readable, such as the Kindle. And I'm going to talk about them as bundles of characteristics that meet various interests on the part of users and producers, and that get produced and distributed through a number of processes. An economist might term these perspectives as, supply and demand. And mostly here I'm going to at least start out by looking at individual books rather than the whole library. So let's start with supply. And one immediately notices that in production and distribution, books are enormously complicated, in some ways much more so than very technologically elaborate goods such as automobiles or computers. In the latter case, in the case of automobiles or computers, a manufacturer hires capital, machinery, labor, other goods, which are in turn produced by other manufacturers that are doing the same. And pretty much everyone in the loop can be described quite simply as being in it for the money, or something that's related to money. And the standard economic logic of cost minimization and profit maximization describes pretty well what's going on. And of course, everybody's always seeking a little bit of a monopolistic edge. People like to make money. But it's hard to hold on to that edge for very long most of the time, and that's life in the market economy. And that applies to computers and such. The book is not nearly so well behaved. In fact, the notion that books are badly behaved is one of the reasons that people care about them so much. Let's keep it simple and consider the pre-IT version, okay? So the electron hasn't been invented yet. And the technology is the printing press. The manufacturer owns the printing press and may either be a publisher or simply sell printing services to a publisher, but somebody owns this very expensive piece of equipment. And each book has a monopoly, at least for a time, on the content that's in it, the words and images that are in them, in the form that they're in, instantiated, granted by the copyright law, as authorized by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, instantiated in various revisions of the Copyright Act, most recently the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And I have to note here that copyright law, at least since 1909, which was an improvement on the previous copyright law, has, every time Congress touched it, gotten worse. Worse in the sense of made it harder for people to reuse work that have protection. And the element that has copyright protection, as I said, is the text and illustrations fixed in a tangible medium. There's an author out there, or many authors, who write books. There's a publisher who participates at least to some degree in the writing of the book as well, possibly commissioning it, almost certainly providing criticism of the writing, copy editing it, designing its form, marketing it to a greater or lesser degree. If it's a popular book, the publisher relies on its judgment and those of various readers and marketers to determine if the thing is likely to sell. If it's an academic book, there are a bunch of reviewers, we call them peer reviewers, whose opinion as to the quality and saleability of the work is almost invariably sought. This, of course, is the origin of publisher-based peer review, is that printing and distributing, if you have a printing press, are really expensive. So, Jim writes a book, and the question is, should somebody publish it? And the publisher's answer to that question, upon looking at the title and the subject, is, I don't know, I don't understand any of this stuff, right? Academic works have this wonderful feature that the set of people who understand what it is that is written in them is purposively small, right? I'm actually not making fun of academic writing here. I'm noting that the method by which we make progress, by and large, is to do elaborate, difficult, technical work that improves on the work that came before. This is true in the humanities, sciences, and social sciences. Every once in a while, somebody actually has something to say that is general and is accessible, and those books sell, but there aren't very many of those in our world. The academic monograph isn't meant to sell well. It's meant to contribute to the literature in a way that allows us not so much to stand on the shoulders of giants, but to stand on the shoulders of pretty short people, but there are lots of them. And that's how we make our progress. But if we're going to find out if it's worth, producing this next bit of accretion of knowledge at all, how are you going to find out if some technical discussion of hedonic pricing models of access to environmental resources in the housing and labor markets is going to be read by anybody, except by asking people who actually care about such things? And that's the source of peer review. The ordinary publisher, the publisher can't know if these things are are very well done or very interesting or not. Notice that when the printing press is not expensive, the original cause of peer review as we know it isn't there. Right? We still use it and we still care about it, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but the purpose was to figure out whether or not it made sense to publish this puppy, which is to say to contribute this expensive piece of capital to printing what used to be 800 copies that would be bought by libraries, which is now 7 copies that will be bought by libraries, which is part of the problem with that industry. And that has changed because in the electronic world, actually, there are still first copy costs. They're not trivial, but the actual cost of distribution is essentially zero. And if I claim that if history had been reversed, if we'd had electronic books first and then we invented print, right, the way in which peer review would play out would be quite different. That's something we can maybe talk about a bit later. So the peer reviewers are sometimes paid by the publisher, a little bit, but almost always are paid mostly by the academic institutions and governments that support academic work. So even if someone pays, I don't know what the University of Oregon Press pays for peer review. You don't have one. Boy, that's the best. God, am I envious of that? I shouldn't say that. I'm on TV. Strike that. I was just kidding, everybody. The peer reviewers might get paid a few $100s. The amount of time that they put in is worth much more than that and is actually paid for. It's part of their academic jobs to engage in such review. And of course, it is part of our academic jobs to engage in such review and to make judgments about the quality of work. It's what we do all the time. We do it when we teach. We do it when we write reviews. We do it when we write our own books. That's all just fine. So, and then the authors in the academic setup are paid again by academic institutions and governments and other funders to acquire the relevant expertise and to do the research and to write it up, and then maybe they get a little bit of royalty on the book. But basically, if you think about the academic book, the transaction between buyer and seller supports only a tiny fraction of what goes into the cost of its production. I'll skip articles because that just makes life too complicated. It's similar but not exactly the same. So digital technologies allow the pieces of all of this to work much more independently of each other than in the case of print. They give authors a much better shot at taking control from the publisher. And indeed, just in today's paper, Amazon says that they're going to give authors 70% of the proceeds of stuff that gets distributed over Amazon. Publishers, on a good day, get up to 20. Amazon's deal is you got to sell the book for less than would be the normal hardcover price, but Amazon is definitely trying to pull the authors away from traditional publishers and pull the publishers away from their traditional contracts with authors. It's a very interesting move, and we'll see what happens. But because actually what Amazon is fighting against is that pretty soon authors will figure out how to distribute their works and not give Amazon any cut at all, right? Because you can sell things, sort of off what used to be the back of the truck. We now call that a website. So there's disintermediation of the various processes that digital actually allow disintermediation of almost everything. And sort of a theme of this talk is that the digital tends towards disintermediation, as I just said, including in the development of production and production of ideas. You can mix and remix parts of text and images and audio and video much more easily in the digital world than you used to be able to do. And the market is always looking for high-scale production economies that can turn handwork into commodities, right? Markets are always looking for things like that. And indeed, that's how printing got started. The printing press made it possible to produce at very high scale books. In the digital world, the scale economies are incurred somewhere else. They're incurred in the production of the fiber and such and the switches of the internet. And now there are scale economies in the distribution of work, of textual work, of books, that no longer have to be borne by the producer and distributor, which is very different from the print in the print world. Okay. And I have to say here that because disaggregation and recombination are easy, because you can link to other texts, even the most loving fans of the book, humanists, are engaging in activities by the minute that are destroying the traditional book's power in the academic marketplace. Linking is just irresistible. And so there are creations now of critical editions that rely on being able to link to other places rather than to merely cite well other places. There are projects. There's a digital humanities project here. You must be doing that kind of stuff here. Everybody's doing things like this. There's a very nice paper by Alan Liu, who's the chair of the English department at Santa Barbara, in a recent copy of the Michigan Quarterly Review, in which he basically says, we've met the enemy and it is us when it comes to preserving the integrity of printed text. The hypertext is just too sweet an opportunity to pass up. Notice then that somebody, if you're going to use hypertext, has got to produce stable addresses for this stuff, and that's a really big problem, a good problem for librarians, by the way, as well as humanists. So anyhow, that's the production side of books. Complicated, and you're actually not paying the same people who are doing the work. So now let's look at this book. We've got this book. What can we do with it? If it's printed rather than one of our new digital book-like things, if it's a book before the invention of those things, there's really no way to reproduce it economically except by reprinting it. So we actually have this book, many copies of it. The production side also produces income for editors and publishers, and sometimes authors, although not much, and for lots of people who work in libraries, some of them librarians, and printers and so forth. And as I've said, whenever there's technical change, there's some people who lose as a result of it. So the way in which the books are produced lead to a set of features on the consumption side that are clumped together in the ways that make the book not just another gadget, and lead to the distress that so many feel at the possibility that the book that we know is going to go away. So here's a big fact. There's a funny, which is, I think, illuminating on the demand side of books and their use. For most goods and services, we can define an ultimate consumer. Here I have this very nice piece of water, and I'm about to be the ultimate consumer of it. So ends the demonstration part of the show. I drive my car, I eat an apple, you use your computer, you take joy in getting a good haircut, whatever. For books, at least for many books, there is a proximate ultimate consumer, if you will, someone who reads the book, often the owner. But then the thing takes on a life of its own. The user is changed by it. And his or her interactions with the rest of the world are changed too. To quote Ringo Starr, you can learn a lot from a book. And once you learn something from that book, you will pass it on to others. It'll change the way you do things and the way you talk to others. We all talk about books that have changed our lives, and therefore others. We act upon and are acted upon by the ideas in books. The framers of the Constitution actually understood this when they talked about granting a monopoly for a limited period of time to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. The whole point of copyright is that we have this book that is going to change, the way we know things. It's going to change. We're going to change each other, and so the idea was that the things that are in the book get reused, changed, passed on, and reuse then is a really big piece. The possibility of reuse is a really big piece of what it is that we like so much about books. And the old copyright law, the doctrine of first sale, which is an element of current copyright law for books, but not for electronic books, is a big helper on reuse. So if I own the book, even though you have the copyright, I can give the book away, I can lend it, I can sell it. I can't copy it, but I can use it in a variety of ways. And if I'm a librarian, I can actually lend it to lots and lots and lots of people. And that is a very important feature of the bundle of activities in the book. Until 1909, by the way, you can look at some books that were published in the early 1900s in the U.S. There's a note in them saying that the rights holder claims that it is illegal to resell the book, right? Now, the copyright law was in fact ambiguous on that, and the courts never sided with that point of view, but the publishers asserted it. This is a habit that publishers fell into, of asserting things about their rights that actually aren't true, that publishers have not yet fallen out of. They rather frequently continue to do this. The 1909 Act made it clear that the doctrine of first sale applied, and once you had sold it, in fact, it was owned by the person who bought it, who could indeed resell it. As I said, that was the last time that copyright law got better. So we can reuse and recombine works depending on the legal regime. And indeed, the fair use provisions in the Copyright Act allow us to quote, to cite quite liberally in most cases. And imagine if we couldn't, right? You couldn't argue with anybody in print because you couldn't cite the other person's print without getting whacked for copyright infringement. And so when, again, a publisher says all rights are reserved, that's a false fact. All rights are reserved except the rights that aren't reserved under Sections 107 and later of the Copyright Act. But for some reason, that would take a lot of ink. It would be very expensive to say that to anybody. And there's no ultimate consumer if something is worth reading. You need to be able to go back and check the source if you're going to be doing scholarly work. Those are essential elements, I think, of scholarship and criticism, is this notion that you can quote and reuse. We couldn't survive without them. There's more. I have this physical object, the book. Here's one. That I can use to, do I have to reshow it or kind of, that I can use to acquire, store, reuse, and distribute information or knowledge or beauty, but for now we'll keep it simple and call it information. And there's an economy of bookstores, libraries, and such that are built around the fact that the book is durable, and incredibly, amazingly, it's both a storage device and a transmission device, and it's built with, it has built-in metadata and finding aids. The title on the jacket says Essays and Addresses by Huxley. I think it's Huxley. Selected Essays and Addresses. The jacket is covered by somebody saying, putting a stamp on it the way librarians do, by Thomas Henry Huxley, yes. And it tells me when and where it was published. And all of that is in it, right? And can't be taken out of it. It's part and parcel of it. You might think this is natural, but it's not. It's very hard to think of any other commodity that carries around with it automatically so much news about what it is, right? Except conceivably some actors. And so the television doesn't do this, theater doesn't do it. The great poets of Homer's day, the ones who the great storytellers did do that. They carried it around with them, although you had to listen to them. You couldn't just look at them to figure out what it was. And actually, interestingly, the loss of that skill was mourned at the time, that printing was really, and not printing, but just writing things down, was getting in the way of the really classy and more community-oriented transmission of ideas. So, so the Kindle, so for most goods and services other than knowledge, storage and use are in wildly different places. And whereas this bundle, not the Kindle, but the bundle of things in a book is extraordinary because it does so many things well at the same time. Libraries of books are easy to browse. Libraries of most other things are not, right? You know, you just have, someone was talking earlier about music scores. Music scores are much more difficult. They sort of all look alike, and they can carry their metadata with them, but they often don't. And notice that the mechanism of scholarship that we so much value requires a stably identified, preserved, and usable collection of both the scholarly and the cultural record. And books just do that for you, except if they're printed on paper that turns into cornflakes because it's acid paper. There's another thing that books do, which is really cool, that the Kindle doesn't. And this was in an op-ed piece by a student in the Michigan Daily, so I was very pleased to see it there. She said, when you're reading a book, sometimes you're supposed to be reading up here, but you glance over there, and you see that, oh my God, so-and-so got shot, or the tire blew, and you sort of think, oh, that changes your whole way that you're going to read the other page. And that's fun. The thing that I like in large part about books relative to the Kindle is that I can flip back and flip forward, which eventually the Kindle will get better at that. I'm going to quote from Nicholson Baker, who had an essay recently in the New Yorker about the Kindle, in which he goes off on a very nice riff. So here's the riff. You can read a Kindle book on a Sony machine. You can't read a Kindle book on a Sony machine or on the Ectacto book, the B-book, the IREX Iliad, the SciBook, the Hanlon V2, or the Foxit eSlick. Kindle books aren't transferable. You can't give them away or lend them or sell them. You can't print them. They are closed clumps of digital code that only one purchaser can own. A copy of a Kindle book dies with its possessor. And that is exactly right, and it's a reason for really preferring this puppy. Baker's complaints about the Kindle are all on the money, and they have bad pictures. They have no page numbers. I've talked about flipping. A few more things that make books much nicer than the Kindle. So walk into my house, walk into your house, there's a bunch of books there. And, we make judgments, we academics, we do. And we're going to look at that bunch of books and decide, what sort of person is this that has this bunch of books? And sometimes, actually, when I catch people looking at my books and realizing that none of the books in the living room are fiction, I say, the fiction is in this room over here, go check it out. And we not only do we play that sort of that social role, and of course there are consultants who will buy you a library full of books that are designed to impress particular audiences, and for all I know, dates, but that's a little much. But the other thing that the books do is they socialize our children in very important ways to who we are. They suddenly realize, there's a point at which they realize that they're actually allowed, mostly, to read the books that are on the shelf, and they discover quite a bit about us from what those books are. Not having that, I don't know how bad that loss is, but it's a loss. And it's a loss that gets right at the heart of who we think we are. Those of us who keep books care a lot about them, or else, why would we keep them? Here's an interesting question that I'm very interested in, and I haven't done the work on, is how many people reread? Because I think the people who are most upset about all this stuff are the ones who are rereaders, and I'll bet this room is full of them. One of my colleagues at Michigan, a philosophy professor named Carl Cohen, read a bit that I'd written along the lines of what I've just discussed, and he said he also uses his books. There are piles of books in his study. They're the ones he's going to come back to. They're the ones for the course he's going to teach next semester. They're the ones for the project that he's working on. They're the ones that he looks at all the time. And having the physical books in those piles helps identify to him where he wants to be. Sure, they could be on a Kindle or they could be on a computer, and indeed he could classify them in some way, but the book does it sort of for you. It has a physicality, and it's just the right size. You can hold it in one hand, and if necessary, you can use it as a jack stand. Books are really quite amazing. There's also a nice paper by Jerome McGann in the Times Literary Supplement a few months ago about how well articulated the critical edition is, and how that works so well in a system of books, and transporting that over to the electronic world is actually going to be very difficult, although it does have this extremely promising aspect. So there's an identity issue here. Those of us who read like the fact that we read. We like it about ourselves. We like it in others. We attach it to books which are visible, portable, and durable. Books are often also beautiful because publishers that was a dimension in which publishers used to compete with each other that hasn't happened so much for ebooks. So this gadget has this wonderful legal framework for reuse, has this wonderful feature of carrying its own metadata, and it has all of this tangibility and visibility. And those things are going to go away in large part. What won't go away is long-form reading, detailed argument. And I can think about gadgets on the gadget, this problem of figuring out what are the books that I've read. Suppose that automatically when I bought an ebook, I got a little holographic tag that would flash itself around the living room and show that that book was in part of my collection. So when you walk into my house, instead of seeing shelves full of books, you'd have this nice, holographic cloud of book titles with other metadata attached to them. One would actually like that because I'm always nervous that we're going to lose the metadata. So if I have some gadget that's reminding me that it's there, I think I would feel better about things. That feels quite contrived at the moment. I'm actually willing to bet that something like that will get invented and be used. And the nth generation Kindle will be able to flip back and forth. And many of these features that we care about so much will be available in the marketplace. The difference is that these features in the book, they aren't available. You can't dodge them if you want to. And I don't know how much we're going to lose to the extent that they are dodged. So I'm taking more time than I should have as usual. And so I'm going to skip the discussion of publishing and jump to a very brief discussion of the Google settlement and then open things up for questions. Is that okay, or should I just stop altogether? Okay, so let me just talk just for a few minutes about the Google settlement, because it does tie into books and the way that they're going to be used. And I'm not going to rehearse the full debate because it takes too long. But they're really, I think the first thing to do in evaluating the Google settlement and the Google Book Project is to figure out what you think the counterfactual would be. If we didn't have this, what would we have? So the first issue is, would we have scanned these books at all? So what Google is doing is really incredible. They've now scanned over 10 million books out of academic libraries, mostly in the United States, a little bit in England. And a lot of those books are in copyright, and there leads to the legal problem. But whereas 5 years ago, 6 years ago, libraries were scanning books at the rate of several tens of thousands a year, Google has been scanning books at the rate of several millions a year, several tens of thousands a week, indeed sometimes a day. And so what had looked like an impossible grand challenge to the world of libraries, which is to have a digitized version of our collections, went from being a grand challenge to something that was almost certainly going to happen in a very short period of time. Yet, many people argue that the scanning never should have been done because, in fact, Google had not cleared the rights. And so Google went and started scanning books both in and out of copyright from these libraries, and they were sued. This is America. We sue people here. And they were sued for copyright infringement, and they were mounting a very interesting defense that librarians loved. The defense was, this is fair use, right? We're actually we're not displaying large amounts of the books, just small amounts. We're indexing them so that people can find out what's in them and then decide whether or not they want to go to a library or go buy them. That indexing is a transformative use and therefore not prohibited by copyright law. And that looked like a pretty good case, and actually Google had pretty good lawyers, and lots of us were pretty happy about the idea that fair use would be extended in this way in the courts. And then we got the horse shot out from under us. Google settled with the authors and publishers, and their settlement did something even more amazing if it goes through. We're now on the second version of it, which is it was going to create a product under which the books would actually be available in the marketplace. So under the first deal, Google was going to digitize these tens of millions of books, but if they were in copyright, nobody could read them, right? Nobody could read them. The library that they were digitized from couldn't read them because we don't have the right to read digitized copies of books that were, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is pretty clear. In fact, the penalties for infringement are quite high, although some of us are blessed by the protection of the 11th Amendment, so we probably wouldn't have actually had to pay, but it would have been unpleasant. Google couldn't read them. Nobody could read them. So we were going to have this funny situation that the printed literature of the 20th century would exist in digitized form. It could be searched, right? You could search for strings of text. You could find page numbers. You could do concordances. You could do lots of stuff, but you couldn't actually read the works. The settlement set up a system under which you could. So Google was going to create this product, sending most of the revenue to the holders of rights, in which people would be able to search this collection and buy electronic rights to the book, and libraries would be able to buy a site license product that would give them access to this whole corpus. Now, for the University of Oregon, that product is even more valuable than it is to the University of Michigan, because you get all of our collection, and our collection is bigger than yours. There likely will be, as a result of this digitizing effort on Google's part, the ability to have access to the in-copyright literature, essentially the literature of most of the 20th century, in digital form at a price, and we can get into debates about how high the price will be. The other thing that is in the settlement is that there's free search of 20% of the content, so that a lot of stuff can be found free by anybody. And there are some other fairly nice features of a free library, a free kiosk in every public library in the country that would give people access to this product. That works well in some small town someplace, not so well in, say, New York. But at least I think, again, adds to the notion that you can use and reuse these digital files, which is the place that we want to get. The other thing we have from the Google work, not from the settlement, is that the out-of-copyright work, the work that has risen into the public domain, is really easy to use. It's really easy to use now. There are now close to 1 million public domain works available through Google Book Search. There are many hundreds of thousands available on the University of Michigan library website. And you can really read them, and you can move around, and you can download at least chunks of them as PDFs. And if people get used to that idea, then maybe they'll get used to the same idea for the 20th century, the in-copyright works, and that, I think, will create more and more demand for having access to this resource. So Google did something quite amazing. They engaged in this activity really not knowing if they had any kind of business model to support it. Now they do through the settlement, with most of the revenue going to others. And the concern that against it are several. One of them is that this will be a monopoly product which eventually will cause monopoly pricing of the kind that we've all experienced from some other vendors. And that would be very bad news for libraries and the academy generally. And there's also a concern that publishers will be much less inclined to let rights revert back to authors. And so particularly academic authors will have trouble getting the rights to their books. I think that second concern is real, but isn't because of Google Book Search. I think publishers, once they figured out that there were going to be electronic versions of things, have already tried to make up ways in which the work can be considered to be in print, and that's going to be the next interesting conversation, especially between academic authors and academic publishers. So what's going to happen? One way or another, the settlement's going to go through or the settlement's not going to go through. But there are going to be tens of millions of books that have been digitized, and society is going to figure out a way to use those tens of millions of books. They're too valuable not to. And we're going to be in the position where more and more reading won't be of this form. And even when it is, what it'll be is someone will decide they want to read a book, and so there'll be a print-on-demand product, and they'll print out a copy for $8, and then they'll toss it. Right? It won't be the book that carries with it the sort of full, rich set of physical properties and data properties that it would have to carry when it was the only version. the official version will be the electronic file. And so the problems that I've discussed, I think, are going to be very difficult to resolve. The way in which we relate to and love our books is, I think, profound. And the question of, can we replicate some version of that? What are the properties that are worth trying to figure out how to build products for? Because that's what it's going to have to require in the electronic world, is an open question. So as you can see, I don't have any very profound conclusions about any of this. I've been thinking about it for quite a while. I have been mystified about why it is that the book is viewed as being so special. I think I'm less mystified than I was, and the next stage is, as Paul Simon once said, what are you going to do about it? That's what I'd like to know. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yeah.
I'm one of those people that never throws away or never resells a book that I've read. Why do you think that I would start discarding print-on-demand books any more than ones that I bought at a bookstore?
Because you'd have still, if you got the print-on-demand book through the Google product or some equivalent product, you would also have electronic access to it, and you could always print another one. Now, it might be that you know.
With my notes.
Okay. Actually, there's an annotation feature in the settlement which will be, so the students love that there's going to be electronic annotation. Okay, so you might not. So you won't. I'm guessing that we will not see serried ranks of $8 print-on-demand paperbacks having the same role that the books that are now on our shelves will have.
My daughter might do that.
Yeah. Whereas now, good for your daughter. I've watched my parents discard most of their parents' libraries, but keep some, and have thought a little bit when the time comes about how I will engage with my parents' library. And projected forward, what are my children going to do? And I'm guessing my children are going to be less sentimental, less attached to those physical books. Although at least they did grow up with them, so it may be that my grandchildren will be the ones that are less so. We'll see. But if the first time you read the book was not right in that old version, I've got the copy of the Jungle Book that my grandmother read to me when I was 5. Right? Well, I'm not giving that puppy up. But the copy that will be read to my granddaughter may well be from an e-reader, and it's going to have a very different feel to her. Although I do want to comment that children's picture books are going to be the last casualties of this war, which is kind of nice. Yeah, sorry.
I think the great tragedy is that it's an economic come down where people who are poor and don't have access to technology in certain ways are not going to have access to books. We're thinking about this e-reader, and it's not going to be in small little places so easy for people to just have a book. We're not going to send, when we had this big thing through, I think it was here, we sent all these books to Africa. People didn't have to know. I think that's a big tragedy.
So I actually think that this goes the other way. That public libraries will have richer collections available, will lend out e-readers with books on them, so people will have access to read the books. Ownership access is more complicated, and I'm not quite sure how that plays out, but so far, e-copies of books haven't been any more expensive than paperbacks, and public libraries are very rapidly adjusting to this market. The biggest market segment is romances on books that are in the e-readers that are being lent out by libraries. And the Google product does have this feature of all public libraries will have at least one reading kiosk. I don't think access gets worse as a result of this. I think the problems are mostly elsewhere. Yeah.
You're an economist, so you get it. And you mentioned earlier in your talk about the problems of monopoly. That is, if you want to maximize your profit, you want to monopolize. How is the Google settlement not giving Google a monopoly?
It's giving them a monopoly over one thing, but not a monopoly over a lot of close substitutes to that thing. And so that helps temper the monopoly. And I also think Google's business model is not to make, is actually to make this thing broadly available rather than narrowly. So it gives, Google absolutely will have under this a monopoly for a time over the, will have a monopoly over the scans that it did, and will be able to sell them under a set of rules. It will also be required to make, on any given search, 20% of the work available for free. So 20% of a book for many purposes, and remember, these are academic monographs principally, right? So 20% of Harry Potter is a very bad substitute for Harry Potter. But 20% of some essay on hydroelectric power on the Dnieper in 1933 may be a very good substitute for the whole book. You can basically thumb through it and decide, I'm not interested in this, or decide, oh, this is interesting enough, so I do want to go look at the whole book. And then the whole book still exists, too. It's still in the library. One of the things that we're doing at Michigan, and most of the other Google partners are now involved in this exercise, is keeping our own copy of all of the works in electronic form. And we can always use that to replace a destroyed or lost print copy, which is a huge advantage to this whole exercise. I hadn't mentioned it before, but to basically to be able to preserve the library collections. So there's that substitute out there as well. And then if things get too outrageous, there's nothing in the Google settlement that doesn't allow rescanning. So if some other producer sees big enough monopoly profits, another producer can indeed rescan and sell at a lower price, and we can have competition. And that is at least technically and legally possible. So there's a bunch of substitutes out there. Yeah.
This is another economy question. So what's going to happen to another element of the book, the value of the book, particularly historical books in terms of marketable value? And the second part of that question is, at the University of Michigan, are you going to continue to acquire books, an institutional imperative that all institutions have when they're available in a virtual form?
So the first question you were asking, what happens to the historical value of rare books and such? Or I think it probably, so libraries are thinking about spending more energy and more space on those books because that's what's going to differentiate them from other libraries. What happens to the sort of used book market for rare books? I don't see much effect here because their cachet doesn't come so much from the content. There are going to be other copies out there that have the content. So you don't read it because you don't know what the words are. You don't read it because it's hard to find and it has particular values as an artifact now, and I think that there's still going to be a market in those. I haven't thought this through, but I don't see big changes in the market for Gutenberg Bibles, or even Helmscott Chaucers, or books of that kind of flavor. Will the University of Michigan buy books where there's a good electronic new copy and the book was actually initially produced electronically? If we have good rights to archival copies, no. We won't always buy a printed book. We will want to buy it in a form where we can make prints from it and use them the way libraries would use such things. But if basically, so Springer is doing a lot of ebooks in the science area. Springer ebooks actually look like mostly collections of articles, but they come as ebooks. And if we have archiving rights to them, and it doesn't make sense for us to commit the space to having a print copy. Very different. So I think that we, the great research libraries, ought to make sure that amongst us we have several copies of the work in the form in which it was produced. But when that form's electronic, that's the form we're going to have it in, and the hard part then is to make sure that we can preserve it well. Actually, electronic preservation is expensive and complicated, but a good deal cheaper than print preservation. So that's, and then of course there are lots of books, especially books written in non-European languages, where we're a long way from them being produced electronically, and we still buy them. Yeah.
Photographs, beautiful illustrations, and all the issues related to, for example, art books, which are a large market where it's not about the typed text, but about the relationship of text and image, or image by itself.
Yeah, so that's also going to come late in this revolution. What we're seeing more and more now with art books or books that are image rich is that that especially university publishers will produce the text with then URLs, stable URLs that link to the images, which is much cheaper, obviously, than having to reproduce the images. We are nowhere near scanning being a good technology for reproducing really high-end art books. And to make that even worse, illustrations where the rights holder is different than the rights holder in the text aren't in the Google settlement to begin with. So I think that that's a piece of bookishness that's going to be much slower to change than books, than the sort of the standard flavor economic monograph, academic monograph, which is mostly words on a page. But there is one piece, I mean, the positive piece really is, and we're seeing this, arrangements where, for example, authors will want to publish with our university press or with our scholarly publishing office, and then put images into the institutional repository at the university that they believe will be stably held there, and indeed they will, and then be able to refer to those images from the book. And the next stage is going to be, the book is going to be some sort of XML file, and you're going to just be able to click on it. And we're going to see a lot of books like that, but it'll be a good long while before art books that were published in the 1980s look like that. Yeah.
When you were talking about print on demand, I mean, something popped in my head. It seemed like, when I think about digital photographs and music, it seems like those two areas have really made a jump now, because it combines really good original digital copies with the ability for the person to easily put, with a photograph I can print it out. So I'm not going to be super interested in just keeping photographs around anymore. With music, I can put it on a CD anytime I want to. It's very cheap. With books, we're starting to print on demand these espresso books to see the ability to print them out fairly cheaply, but it's not something we can do at our home individually. It seems like maybe we'll reach that same kind of tipping point with books, but I think you've done a good job of pointing out the ways in which this thing has got to go for a while, and it's going to be a little bit more bumpy.
Yeah, although I think for people who are a bit younger than we are, the printing part may not be important. That remains to be seen. At the article level, it plainly still is. People like to make notes on articles. They will for a long time. But they may be perfectly happy. They like to remix music, and they like to remix video, and they just may remix the text. And to the extent that you have high-quality, text-to-voice gadgets, which they're getting better and better, they may say, hey, that's cool. Let's just read in a little bit of War and Peace here and add it to whatever else we're putting into the mashup. Yeah.
I used to be in the bookstore business, and even before that and since then, and during that time, one of the things that I miss the most is small bookstores, with an independent bookseller who knows their own stock and talk to you and lead you to some gem that you never would have heard about otherwise. Have you done any work on that?
So I wrote a really good blog entry when Cody's closed, which was a sort of mourning and mournful entry. Ann Arbor's best bookstore, Shaman Drum, closed last summer. So here's what I think. I think that we're going to use the fact that people who like books hang out in libraries to start using libraries as places to sell books. It made no sense for libraries to do that before, but now actually the libraries have a very good distribution mechanism electronically. We all have thick pipes to the world, and print-on-demand solutions in the $50,000 to $100,000 range work really quite well. And I can imagine libraries as booksellers. After all, the group that you want to get at in the bookstore are exactly the people who are likely to show up in libraries, and bookstores don't seem to be able to make it on their own anymore, with the exception of Powell's, long may it live.
So I think one last question from Barbara.
Thank you. Mine is just a technical one. I'm curious about works to which access is limited to 20%. How is the 20% determined, and by whom? If I request it, do I get the same 20% as the next user?
So no. The 20% is going to be based in part on what text string you threw in there, and you'll get a few pages around that, and then some other pages picked at random. Then you can, this is how I understand this is going to work, throw in another text string, and you get a different few pages around that. There will be parts of the book, in particular the end, that will not ever be accessible. And there may be some particular chapters that will be blocked out to prevent you from putting the whole book together. But in most cases, my understanding of how this is going to have to work is that if you're willing to work hard, you can get at more than 20%. I can imagine publishers configuring books with that in mind. Yeah, there's a service you can. Now there's a service you can sell, right?
Books that are coming out. There's a lot of junk junky editions that are coming out that are sort of useless.
So the bibliographic quality of the Google project so far is, to put it mildly, uneven, and in parts hilarious. They're very multi-volume works they haven't figured out yet, and there are lots of mistakes. So I think that it's actually going to be the scholars and the academics who are going to have to clean this up. Google is continually working on refinements, but they're way behind us. In the HathiTrust, the library version, we're spending a lot of energy looking at editions and trying to get the metadata right and handling multiple volume works. We're much better about at that than Google. Google likes to do things in a algorithmic, machine-driven way. I do too, because it's cheap, but you can't get all the way there that way. And I think that's better understood. That's well understood by academic librarians. So there's still very much a role for bibliographers. If the only version of these collections was the one in the Google Book Search product, that would be an extremely bad outcome, especially from the point of view of scholarship. But it won't be the only version.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank all of you for your fabulous questions and your attendance. There are refreshments in the back, so I encourage you all to stay and ask more questions of Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you.